Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Allow me first to introduce myself. I'm Alexander Bird. I'm the Peter Sowerby Professor of Philosophy and Medicine here at King's. I'm also director of the Philosophy and Medicine Project. And this project and my chair are generously funded by the Peter Sowerby Foundation. The Peter Sowerby Foundation was founded by Peter Sowerby, a Yorkshire GP, and Peter's personal wealth had been generated on the basis of software that he and a colleague had developed to manage their medical records. Peter decided to use this wealth for charitable purposes that focus on medical research and healthcare, on education, and on the community and the environment. A wide range of initiatives have benefited from the generosity of Peter Sowerby and his foundation, from, for example, amongst very many, Action for Stammering Children to the National Youth Jazz Orchestra. So I mentioned that the foundation supports the Philosophy and Medicine Project at King's, a reflection of Peter's belief that to use Galen's words, the best physician is also a philosopher. Benefiting from the foundation's generosity are here in this project a variety of activities such as a weekly colloquium, numerous workshops and conferences, for example, the workshop on conceptual issues in biological psychiatry that has been running yesterday and today, organised by Harriet Feinberg and Annalie Jefferson. Centrally to this project is a growing teaching programme which includes teaching philosophy to almost 500 first-year medical undergraduates at King's, as well as a new CPD offering to GPs that's taking place for the first time next month. The centrepiece of our public engagement activities is this annual Peter Sowerby lecture. Past lecturers have been Javi Carell, Jacob Stegenga, Gareth Owen, and Sir Ian Chalmers. I am delighted that this year's lecturer is Professor Raymond Tallis. No one, in my mind, embodies better the Sowerby-Galen ideal of a physician who is also a philosopher. I'm also delighted that to introduce Ray to you, should you not know enough about him, we have Lord Turnberg. Leslie Turnberg is one of the most eminent of British physicians. While Leslie's specialism is gastroenterology, his contributions to medicine extend well beyond that field. To list all his achievements and positions of leadership would mean leaving little time for Ray's lecture. So I will mention only that he was professor and then dean of the medical school at the University of Manchester in the 1970s and 80s. In the 90s, he was very eminently the president of the Royal College of Physicians, and in the 2000s he was the first head of the National Centre for the Replacement, Refinement and Reduction of Animals in Research. Leslie was knighted in 1993, and in 2000 he was raised to the peerage as Baron Turnberg of Cheadle. Thank you, Leslie, for your participation in this lecture, and may I invite you to introduce Ray.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your kind words. This is Ray Tallis's lecture, and it's a great pleasure and indeed an honour to introduce my good friend, Ray Tallis, this evening. I don't think I need to tell you that he is a most unusual man, a philosopher with a keen sense of the ridiculous, a puncturer of pomposity and of ludicrous ideas, and all with such a fine sense of humour that when he points out the fallacies of your argument, you hardly notice how stupid you've been. And amongst his friends, he suffers fools gladly. He is simply regarded by his friends as the thinker from Liverpool. He was described as the thinker from Liverpool. But for those in high authority who push out their unreasoned views on an unquestioning public, he can be quite vicious. He has been particularly incensed by the French philosophers and thinkers, the existential thinkers, Saussure and his followers, whose writings were incomprehensible to me until Ray burst their balloon with books like Not So Sure and essays on theoria. I was completely with him when he wrote that he had a strong preference for realistic fiction, where words mean what they say. And he resented the implication that this preference for realism was symptomatic of an infantile disorder. No one can say he has an infantile disorder. We will never know what Saussure would have thought of this. He died in 1913. When Ray said, and I resonate with him when he said, when the emperor is restocking his wardrobe, he usually shops in Paris. There's a blow for French philosophers, although Saussure was Swiss, I gather. But that's far from his only target. He pulls no punches about what he calls neuromythology. That's a field rich with neuroscientists busily combing the neural circuitry, the electrophysiology of the brain, searching for human consciousness. Where in the brain should we be looking for the idea of beauty, love, appreciation of art and music? And this evening, I suspect he'll be helping us with answering those questions. But it's little wonder that the magazine Philosophy Now awarded him the Against Stupidity Award. That sounds like a great award to have. Now, talking of stupidity, he's taken his axe to criticize the government's handling of the NHS. The obsession with reorganization and re-disorganization of the NHS. His book, NHS SOS, says it all. Well, you'd expect him to know something about that as someone who's worked in the NHS as a physician and a professor of geriatrics for many years, and you'd expect him to know a bit about the human body, which of course is another of his obsessions. His books on the hand and on the finger, you should really read the one about the finger, because it points the way to what is human. And of course, one on a fantastical journey around your head, mostly his own head, I have to say, in and out of every orifice as he searches for what it is that makes us cry or yawn or even kiss. Well, here is the man described by The Economist as one of the top polymaths in the world, but one, surprisingly, who has never held an academic position in philosophy. And yet here he is delivering this Sowerby lecture. Now, I realize what I've done is describe some of his outstanding achievements. But what I haven't said is what a remarkable human being he is. Full of fun and good humor, a great friend, and as down to earth as you might imagine, someone who has dealt with the elderly so kindly over many years. You probably know how well his feet are planted firmly on the ground when you understand that he writes most of his books in a pub with his beer-stained laptop in front of him and a pint of Stella next to him. That's Ray Tallis. It is then a real pleasure for me to ask Professor Raymond Tallis to give the Peter Sowerby lecture entitled Are You Your Brain? Neuroscience or Neuromania?
Les, and indeed, Alexander, thank you very much indeed. And after such a wonderful introduction, the most sensible thing for me to do would be to drop dead. Because there is nothing that could possibly meet the expectations that in particular Les has raised. I have to say, Les and I go back a long way. I think 1988, scholars quarrel, it may be 1888, but we do go back a long way, and Les has been a fantastic colleague in Manchester when he was the dean and I was a newly arrived professor who made me very welcome. We've had some wonderful times since then, so thank you for that marvellous introduction. You've had the best of the evening, basically. So in fact, those of you who want to have a little, as it were, vacation from your consciousness, now is the time to take it, because I can tell you what the answer to the question is, are you your brain? The answer is, you're not your brain. So that's it, really. Spoiler alert, that's the end of this lecture. And I say, those of you now wish to have a little vacation may certainly take it. I'm going to talk about neuroscience, but more specifically about neuromania. What I'm going to offer you is a short critique of neuromania. Now, I want to head off some misunderstanding, first of all. Sometimes when I've talked about these matters, I've been accused of all sorts of things, that I'm against biological science. Nonsense. I was a medic for 40 years, and if I did any good in those 40 years, and the jury's still out on that, if I did any good in those 40 years, it was dependent entirely on biological science, of course. I don't have a religious agenda. I'm not trying to revive the soul. I am a secular humanist. And by the way, I do believe that the human organism was generated by the processes originally described by Darwin. His theory is beyond reasonable doubt, and the extraordinary thing about the theory of evolution is that all sorts of new discoveries and techniques since he wrote it have only made his theory seem stronger. If you think about the discovery of carbon dating, continental drift, filling in the gaps in the fossil record, all of those things have made Darwin's theory stronger. So I'm not, of course, anti-Darwinist. And so it follows I'm not a creationist. I've been accused of all these things. I've even been accused of being a dualist and suggesting that somehow a human being is a ghost in a machine. So I want you to set aside all those prejudices against me when I talk about neuromania. What I am is a humanist. And it seems to me that the challenge of humanism is to arrive at an understanding of ourselves that avoids, on the one hand, a supernatural or broadly religious account of what we are and how we came about. So that's one, as it were, the Scylla to avoid. The Charybdis to avoid is a naturalistic view that sees us as entirely part of nature and probably as just smart chimps. I'm against not biology, but biologism, the belief that human beings are essentially biological organisms and that they are best understood through the biological sciences. Of course, many things about us are understood through biological sciences, but what is uniquely and interestingly about human being, I don't think the biological sciences offer much insight. What we are is irreducibly persons. Persons who are neither, on the one hand, mere organisms, or on the other hand, good or bad angels. We are, and this is a term from the great French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, not all French philosophers are bad, who described us as embodied subjects. And of course, in addition, mysteriously, we are genuinely agents. We initiate things. Each of us is a point of departure in the world, something that's very difficult to understand if we are reduced simply to organisms. But having said that, we are not ghosts that have somehow got caught up in the biological machinery. The full story of what I'm going to say is spread out in great length in this book, Aping Mankind, which was reissued a couple of 3 or 4 years ago. And just to continue, as it were, with my case of samples, this is the latest book, which takes the story a bit further. So that's just come out just recently. So, neuromania. What is neuromania? Well, it is the notion that human consciousness is identical with neural activity in the human brain. It follows, therefore, that I am my brain and you are your brain. that the brain explains every aspect of awareness and behavior, and brain science will ultimately do that. More importantly, to understand human beings, what you need to do is to peer into the intracranial darkness using the techniques of neuroscience, like functional magnetic resonance imaging, electroencephalography, and so on. All of these are wonderful techniques. They're ones that came into use during my period as a doctor who had a particular interest in neuroscience, stroke, epilepsy, and so on. So they're fantastic when it comes to advancing clinical neuroscience and neurology, but they are not metaphysical instruments. Neuromania also maintains that traditional philosophizing about the mind is or should be dead. Get out the armchair and go into the laboratory if you want to understand about the human mind. One of the people who has been a major figure in this whole movement in philosophy is Patricia Churchland, who produced a landmark book in 1986 called Neurophilosophy. And she argued that if we're going to be good philosophers of mind, we really need basically to focus on brain science. And she's continued this story, and I reviewed this book of hers for the TLS recently, that basically we can understand even our conscience just by simply looking harder, peering harder at the brain. The individual's judgment as to what is right or wrong, she said, is a brain construct rooted in our neural circuitry, I beg your pardon. So the brain is the mysterious bridge from is to ought, solves that hoary problem in philosophy of getting from an is to an ought. So neuromaniacs would say you can get the am of the person out of the is of the brain, you get the ought of morality out of the is of the brain. And so if you want to know about things like love, or wisdom, or our sense of beauty, you've just got to do better and better brain science using more and more complex instruments. The most complex of all the instruments, or the one that's attracted most attention, is functional magnetic resonance imaging. And I suspect I don't need to explain to this audience that what's exciting about functional magnetic resonance imaging is that you can see neural activity in the waking brain of human beings. But it's excited people so much that they think it is a kind of metaphysical tool. It's been described by Matt Crawford as a fast-acting solvent of the critical faculties. Now, a lot of people feel that the notion that we are our brain is a recent discovery. It's the result of all our very clever advances in neuroscience. It's not so recent. Here's a chap, Hippocrates, who basically was no longer the staff of Manchester University by the time that Les and I started. He said that men ought to know that from the brain and from the brain only arise our pleasures, joys, laughter and jests, as well as our sorrows, pain, grief and tears. Through it, the brain in particular, we think, see, hear, and distinguish the ugly from the beautiful, the bad from the good, the pleasant from the unpleasant. And this is strikingly similar to something that Francis Crick, who took an interest in the later part of his life in human consciousness, in his book published in 1994, who said exactly what Hippocrates was saying. Your joy and sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Well, my challenge is to those who would wish to conflate brains and persons. And this is the agenda I want to cover. I want to briefly look at ways in which brains have been construed as persons. I won't say much about that. I'm then going to talk about the apparent justification for doing so. Then what I think are good reasons for not conflating persons and brains. And then finally, in perhaps a spirit of humility, acknowledge the challenges that face those who actually, like me, distinguish brains from persons, because we too have problems. So in what ways are our brains construed as persons? Well, for some, you are all of your brain. That's it. You and your brain are the same thing. For others, you're just parts of your brain, basically the cortex, or in the case of Francis Crick, the claustrum. The self was in the claustrum because so many neural pathways seem to converge on that spot. Instead of thinking about macroscopic structures, perhaps we can think of ourselves as somehow the software that's implemented in the brain's hardware. And computational theories of minds and brains and persons bring those things together. Or, and this is very popular, you are your connectome. And why is it so popular? Because it attracts vast quantities of grants. The connectome is, if you like, the sum total of the connectivity at the microscopic level of the brain. And some of you will be familiar with the fact that the EU had funded something like £2 billion on a massive study to look at all the connections at a microscopic level within the brain. In other words, you are how your brain is wired up. So these are ways in which brains and persons get conflated. There's a deep ambiguity there. It's sort of about the function of the brain, but it's sort of about the structure of the brain. Perhaps it's the functional structure of the brain. Or perhaps it's the neural activity taking place in that functional structure at any one time. I just leave that ambiguity hanging in the air. I move on to why we might think that persons are their brains, while you and I are our brains. What's the justification? Well, there's some pretty homely justifications. The hair of the eye is located where the brain is located. Basically, Raymond Tallis, the person Raymond Tallis, is in London because his brain's in London. If you chopped his leg off and left it in Manchester, as long as he wasn't bleeding to death, he basically would still be able to come to London. So he is where his brain is. Pretty homely stuff. And the brain, or the head, is at the center of what philosophers talk about as egocentric space. And we also know, tragically, that severe brain damage may lead to loss of consciousness or indeed loss of personhood. And less severe brain damage may cause impairment of consciousness and changes in personality. As well as the effects of brain damage, which seem to support the idea that everything, from the slightest tingle of sensation to the most exquisitely constructed sense of self, are somehow dependent on the brain, there are other observations that seem very relevant to the claim that brains and persons are the same. First of all, there are correlations observed between neural activity and levels of wakefulness. Many of you will be familiar with how the EEG looks when you're asleep as compared with how the EEG looks when you're awake. How the EEG changes as you slide down, perhaps as the audience is sliding down, even now, down the Glasgow coma scale. And there are correlations, often very precise, between neural activity and certain aspects of consciousness, perceptions, memories, emotions, and thought. Actually, the correlations are not as straightforward, and perhaps we can discuss those, but there appear to be correlations. And there is a loose correlation of patterns of brain activity with behavior and propensity to behave in a certain way. There's been all sorts of excitement about the notion that, say, the balance between the activity in your frontal lobes and the activity in your amygdaloid body determines the extent to which you are or are not psychopathic. What can we conclude from these empirical observations? Well, a correct conclusion is quite a homely one, that to live as a person requires a brain in some kind of working order. Nobody's going to doubt that. You chop my head off, the lecture stops and my IQ falls, all of those things. That's correct, but contestable is the notion that living as a person is being a brain in some kind of working order. And that difference is really at the center of this talk. We could put it another way and say that the brain is a necessary condition for awareness and behavior, but it doesn't follow from this that it's a sufficient condition for normal awareness and behavior. And let me illustrate the difference between a necessary and sufficient condition for the non-philosophers in the audience by this example. In order to be knocked down by a bus in London, I have to be in London. I'm pleased to report that being in London is not a sufficient condition of being knocked down by a bus in London. Otherwise, you would be spared this lecture. And there are certain conceptual leaps that lead to the identification of persons and their brains. A leap from the rough correlations that we see, and they are much more rough than often admitted, to the notion of correlations between neural activity and aspects of consciousness, the leap from that correlation to causation, to the idea that that neural activity causes consciousness. And another leap that not only does it cause consciousness, but is actually identical with it. Now, some people may feel, well, actually, we've got plenty of evidence about the identity of consciousness at every level and brain activity. And they may cite stimulation work. And I want to refer to some very famous work that was carried out in the 40s, 50s, and 60s of the last century by neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield. And I want those who are familiar with this work just to forgive me for going over it. Wilder Penfield was one of the pioneers of neurosurgery for epilepsy. He suggested that we could control otherwise intractable epilepsy by cutting out the bit of the brain that was causing the seizures. But of course, he was very concerned not to cut out bits of the brain that were absolutely essential for functions such as speech. So he did his operations in waking subjects. And prior to cutting out the relevant bits of the brain, he stimulated the brain in various places to find out which bits of the brain were associated with speech and so on and so forth. And one of the most interesting observations he made was that if he stimulated parts of the brain, temporal lobe and so on, people could often have the restoration of memories. They would actually have quite complex memories. There's a very famous case of one of his patients who described remembering the circus coming to town when she was a child. Now, I have to say, he didn't always hit the spot. Many patients didn't report these complex experiences. But it would suggest that if by stimulating the brain you can get a complex experience, then is it not true that brain activity is not only a necessary condition of consciousness, but by itself can be a sufficient condition? Well, I have to say no, it doesn't follow from that, because, just to remind you, Penfield's studies were done in subjects who were already awake. And what's more, their complex experiences, or complex memories, were of experiences that had been had in the normal way in a person who had a very complex grasp of the world, the very notion of a circus coming to town and so on and so forth. In other words, these experiences, as a result of stimulation of the brain, weren't standalone. So I've dealt with the apparent justification for suggesting that you are your brain and every aspect of your consciousness is identical with brain activity. But there are reasons for not accepting this identity. And I want to look at aspects of personhood. I want to talk a bit about consciousness, which is, of course, a sine qua non of being a person. I want to talk about viewpoints, and in particular, first-personal viewpoints that we all of us have. I want to talk about something that's often overlooked, which is the extraordinary unity of our consciousness and indeed ourself at a particular time. I want to say something about temporal depth, the sense of I extended over time. And finally, I want to say something about agency. I suppose we could rephrase the question of, are you your brain, is to actually say, well, you know, the brain is a piece of matter. And could a piece of matter, something whose definitive description is to be found in the physical sciences, be or generate the consciousness of a person? Well, this is an idea that has been embraced almost as an act of faith for decades amongst neuroscientists. Emile Dubois Raymond, in 1842, said that he and Brucker, another great neurophysiologist or physiologist, pledged a solemn oath to put into power this truth: no other forces than the common physico-chemical ones are active within the organism, including the brain. And more recently, many of you may have read Daniel Dennett's Consciousness Explained. And this quote, I think, is absolutely central to his particular point of view. There's only one sort of stuff, he says, namely matter, the physical stuff of physics, chemistry, and physiology. And the mind is somehow nothing but a physical phenomenon. In short, the mind is the brain. And this is the important bit. We can, in principle, account for every mental phenomenon using the same physical principles, laws, and raw materials that suffice to explain all sorts of other things: radioactivity, continental drift, photosynthesis, reproduction, nutrition, and growth. Well, let's see how that view stands up in relation to consciousness. Doesn't seem to stand up very well. And actually, there is a very famous quote from Alfred Russel Wallace, some of you may know as an extremely generous-spirited man who discovered the theory of evolution effectively roughly the same time as Darwin was about to publish his Origin of Species. And he said that the passage from the physics of the brain, the kind of physics that Dennett was talking about, to the corresponding facts of consciousness is unthinkable, where our minds and senses so expanded, strengthened, and illuminated as to enable us to see and feel the very molecules of the brain. Were we capable of following all their motions, we should be as far as ever from the solution of the problem, how are these physical processes connected with the facts of consciousness? The chasm between the two classes of phenomena would still remain intellectually impassable. The neurophilosopher would say, it may look like that, but it's a brute fact. Just get over it. That's how things are. Hence, Dennett. There is only one sort of stuff, namely matter, and in principle we can account for every mental phenomenon using the same physical principles, and so on and so forth. So we need to rephrase this question of identity between a person and a brain to say, can you be a sincere materialist, as someone like Dennett says, that where basically the material of the brain has the same properties that are seen throughout the material universe? Can you be a sincere materialist and believe that persons can be built out of neural activity using the same physical principles, laws, and raw materials that suffice to explain radioactivity and continental drift? That there's, at the fundamental level, there's nothing special about the brain. Well, there's something a bit special about consciousness. And I want to talk about intentionality. Now, this is a concept that's been in philosophy for thousands of years. It was first discussed by the Stoics. It was absolutely central to medieval philosophy, and then it was reintroduced into philosophical discourse as a central notion in the late 19th century by Brentano and those who followed him. And I want to see this concept at work in something absolutely basic, the ground floor of consciousness. Forget about sense of beauty, forget about wisdom. Let's look at something simple, like this person looking at a glass. I'm going to focus on vision because one of the extraordinary things about vision is that there is an explicit distance between the experiencing subject and the experienced object. And that distance, the sense of you over there and me over here, is itself experienced. We experience the aboutness of our own perceptions. This is an incredibly simplified picture of the perception of an ordinary object like a glass. Now, the top arrow basically describes something that conforms entirely to the kind of thing that Dennett was talking about. Basically, when I see a glass, there's light from the glass that travels through the air, lands on my retina, tickles up my neurons, causes neural activity in my visual pathways, and eventually causes, activity in my occipital cortex at the back of my head. And all of that falls entirely within the kind of laws of nature that Dennett was talking about. But there's something missing. There's something very strange. The story doesn't end with the causal flow that reaches the visual cortex. There's something else that happens. Basically, that activity in the visual cortex is aware of its own source, or one of its causes. It's about one of its causes. In this case, it's about the glass. And that's what the intentionality of the gaze is about. Now, having a causal arrow going one way, and an intentional arrow going the other way, actually is very vulnerable to misinterpretation. Yes, the inward causal chain explains how the light gets into my brain, but not how this results in a gaze that looks out, linking a subject with an object of perception. But in saying that, I'm not suggesting for a moment that something comes out of the eye, that there is an eye beam, that there is extramission. Interestingly, there's a study which showed about 70% of people in the United States believe the eye sends stuff out in order to see. But that's, but then 40% of them voted for Trump. So you can see that Standards are not high. I knew I'd get a cheap laugh. It's sort of, I'll mention Johnson for another cheap laugh in a second. So I'm not suggesting that there's something extra mission. In fact, the arrow that goes outwards is not going into physical space. It's going into something that is created called phenomenal space. And that phenomenal space is not something that can be accommodated by the kind of laws of physics that Dennett was talking about, and that Brooker and the 19th century neurophysiologists were talking about. Intentionality has caused huge embarrassment for a lot of philosophers, and many of them don't want it to actually, they want to deny it. And they've even suggested, well, the visual cortex, what happens in visual cortex, it's not really about something out there, it's actually the brain's experience of itself. Well, actually, if the brain only experiences itself, then everything that I appear to be experiencing at the moment will be some kind of illusion. And some have even suggested that. So you can see that this insincere materialism wobbles into something which philosophers would call idealism. I want to give you an example of one such philosopher, Alex Rosenberg, who hates intentionality because it's such an awkward thing. The mind, he says, is identical with the brain. So thoughts, which are about things and have intentionality, a thought must be an event in the brain. But no neural activity can be about anything outside the brain, or indeed outside our mind. No thought, he says, therefore, is about anything. Well, actually, his own book illustrates that as a possibility, insofar as his own thoughts try and be about nothing. But unfortunately, much to his irritation, they are about almost something. But intentionality, this is just the beginning of a very, very big story. Because intentionality creates the possibility of an ever-widening gap between a conscious individual like you and me and the material world. In fact, one way of expressing this, is the way that philosophers have, is that it sort of breaks open the causally closed material world. The material world, again, that Dennett was talking about in that quotation. It actually then becomes the basis of agency. And I'm going to say a little bit about agency in due course. When we seem to act on the natural world as if from some kind of outside. The intentionality I've described of perception is just the absolute ground floor. One of the striking things about human beings is they join their intentionality. And you see that from very early on. Anybody who's seen a child growing up knows that by the age of a year, it's endlessly pointing out things to others. It is sharing its experience with others. It's the aboutness that it experiences, it shares with others. Pointing is absolutely central to our passage from, if you like, the solipsist child of experience to the adult who's part of a community of mind. And Les kindly mentioned that I'd written a book on pointing because it is so absolutely central to the joining of intentionality, which is developed to a unique extent in human beings. Some people have said chimps and others have it, but actually, if you look at pointing in chimps, some of them show what's called imperative pointing, a sort of gimme pointing in captivity, but none of them appear, even in captivity and certainly not in the wild, to show the kind of declarative pointing of shared experience. The joining of intentionality via gesture, language, and other modes of explicit being together, co-presence, creates a shared public world. And this is the world in which human beings live. And it's at a greater and greater distance from nature. And that distance matches the distance between persons and brains. Of course, the brain has to mediate all these things, but the brain is just the starting point. And indeed, joined intentionality is the basis of shared agency. Shared agency, which is expressed in many ways, not just in teamwork, but the very artifactual structure of the human landscape. It's also the ultimate basis of the kind of things that certain neurophilosophers, such as Patricia Churchland, try to explain on the basis of brain activity. It's the basis of the norm-regulated artifactscape that is the human world. Now that may, for those of you who are not philosophers, that may be quite tough going, and I'm happy to discuss it further. But that's absolutely central to the distance between persons and their brains. And you can unpack that distance in different ways. One is that we have viewpoints. We have a perspectival, interest-rooted viewpoint. We are at the center of our egocentric spaces. Of course, there are no centers in the material world. There's no such thing as here in the material world. There's no such thing as there, or indeed elsewhere. We are creatures, as Heidegger, the great German philosopher, said, greatly flawed German philosopher, said, we face a world rather than being causally wired into it. We turn back on the world and look at it. Let me say a bit about unity, because this is extraordinarily interesting. It's something that's easily overlooked. At any given moment, we are not merely conscious of things, but co-conscious of many separate things in a conscious field. As I'm talking now, I can hear my voice droning on. I can see your faces gradually looking more and more glum. I can feel the pressure under my feet as I'm standing here. I have sort of one or two cues to myself as to what I'm going to say next. And all of those things amount to my conscious moment. These things somehow merge as a unity, but they don't mush, they don't collapse into one another. And this has been a great mystery to neuroscientists, and it's been described as the binding problem. How do all the bits and pieces bind together? How do they all add up? How does, for example, my seeing the shape of an object and the distance of an object and the color of it, how do they all bound together? At the same time, I can see them separately when I want to attain to it in whatever way. All sorts of suggestions have been made, including synchronous electric discharges throughout the brain. Francis Crick, for a while, was very excited about this idea that 35 hertz activity throughout the brain would somehow bind everything together. Some would suggest electromagnetic fields. The most funny, as far as I'm concerned, is quantum coherence, or indeed sometimes quantum entanglement, because actually that would be unlikely to produce more than 10 to the minus x seconds of coherence, and that would be hardly enough to sustain even the attention span of a teenager. So that's unity, and clearly is not the kind of property that is seen, that again Dennett described. But there's something also that is even more extraordinary, which is not merely unity at a time, but unity over time. The fact that we have memories, that we feel responsible for what we did in 1973, that we have a sense of the past, of a past that engaged us, and so on and so forth. Henri Bergson mocked the idea of memory as a cerebral deposit, that it was merely an effect of previous experience that altered the brain's reactivity, which of course is the standard neuroscience account of memory, or that memory is a reactivation of neural pathways that have been activated in association with experience. Well, it doesn't work, because the present state of a material object doesn't reach upstream to the prior causes of its present state. And we think about explicit memory, my remembering, say, the journey to this lecture. It has not merely the intentionality of an experience I've talked about, it has a double intentionality. My memory is about an experience, and the experience was about an event. So if intentionality of perception is difficult, then the intentionality of memory, of the double intentionality of memory, is even more difficult for the kind of account that Dennett and others feel that we are on the verge of through neuroscience. But perhaps most profoundly, we live in tensed time. I have a clear sense of the past, I have a clear sense of the future, and I have a clear sense of now. In the physical world, there is no past, present, or future. There's no now, no longer, and no not yet. Don't take it from me, take it from the experts. Einstein, in particular, regretted that there was nothing in the general theory of relativity that could, as it were, make sense of tensed time. And just to illustrate this, I want to illustrate with a letter he wrote to the widow of his great friend, Michele Besso. Besso and he were great mates when they were young, and they stimulated each other, and Einstein felt very grateful to Besso's encouragement when he was a young upcoming scientist. Scroll forward 40 years, and Besso dies. So Einstein writes a letter to Mrs. Besso, basically to try and, as it were, console her. Didn't quite really the kind of letter that you really would want if you are a recently bereaved widow. What he said was, physicists know that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. Cheer up, ducky, essentially was what he was saying. But clearly, what he was saying was that tends to time such as it's absolutely central to human consciousness, where I am very aware of something that happened in the past and that it happened into the past and that it happened to a past version of me, all of that has no place in the kind of physics and the physical world that Dennett was talking about. A brain at a given time, time t, is a brain at time t. But you and I at time t are thinking about time t minus x and time t plus x. We are, unlike our brains, temporally extended at a particular time. And what's more, the world of persons like you and me is populated with possibilities of things that have happened, things that might happen, whereas the material world, alas, is confined to actualities. I want to end up by talking about agency. And I want to talk about some experiments that caused huge excitement when they were first reported and have continued to cause huge and, I think, inappropriate excitement in the succeeding 30 or odd years. These are some experiments by a neurophysiologist, Benjamin Libet. Unconscious cerebral initiative and the role of conscious will in voluntary action. They're experiments that were described by Patrick Haggard, who is a very eminent physiologist but also a philosopher, who described Libet's work as one of the philosophically most challenging studies in modern scientific psychology. What did Libet do? Well, he did some studies in which he asked subjects to flex their wrists or their digits. Very simple action. And what he did at the same time, using electroencephalography, he timed the so-called readiness potential that said the brain was ready to make the movement, to drive the movement. At the same time, he asked the subjects to time when they felt the urge to make the movement. They were allowed to make the movement at any time they felt like it. It was a voluntary movement. So there was two things that were being measured. One is the timing of the readiness potential, and the other was the timing of the intention. And what Libet found was that the readiness potential, showing the brain was ready to make the movement, preceded awareness of intention. Not by very much, third of a second rather, and possibly open to all sorts of methodological problems, and we can perhaps discuss them. Scroll forward 20-odd years, and we have some studies by John Dillon Hayes and colleagues, not using EEGs, but using functional magnetic resonance imaging, that fast-acting solvent of the critical sense. And what they found, well, what John Dillon Hayes, again, he asked the subject to do something very simple, either move this or move this. And basically what they found was there were changes in the brain that appeared to be about 7 or 8 seconds in advance of the person apparently making the decision to move this or this. He concluded from this that there is a network of control areas in the brain that begins to prepare a decision long before it enters awareness. So what can we conclude from that? Well, what's been concluded by some philosophers is we don't know what we're doing until we found we'd done it, or that basically the brain's in charge. Daniel Wegner generalized from these and many other studies that the only connection between willing and acting is not that you will your action, but that both the willing and the action come from the same unconscious source. The sense that you're doing something is merely something that's built into your brain because it's of evolutionary assistance. Let's scroll back and let's look at the studies, and let's focus perhaps on Benjamin Libet's studies. What was the action? It really wasn't an action, it was just that. It's only a small component of a real-world action, and the story of the action begins much earlier. And let me tell you the story of the action. It involves Mrs. Smith, who's a volunteer for the study. She read in the newspaper that there were these clever scientists doing studies on the brain. She has a child who has brain injury, and she wants to help those clever scientists, as it were, to discover more about the brain because it may help her child who has brain damage. So she brings up the laboratory and she agrees that she's going to become a subject in this study, which involves doing this. She sets the alarm the night before, just to make sure she doesn't oversleep and annoy Professor Libet. She then sets off in high spirits in a car, arrives in the car park, has a row with somebody about a parking space, and then comes into the building, finds her way to Professor Libet's laboratory, is invited, sits down, listens to what the experiment is about, understands he's not going to do anything horrible to her, consents to the experiment, understands the purpose of the experiment, in particular why she's got to time her intention to make a movement. And then, as a final thing, she makes the movement. And it's perfectly obvious this little movement is only a small part of a huge and complex action. But by focusing on that little movement, the action has been, or human actions have been reduced to atoms of movement. All the context has been stripped off. Because our intentions aren't little sort of spurts of will, they belong to an intentional field that belongs to a self. It belongs to a human world. And in fact, if basically our actions consist of little movements like this, the conditions that make the experiment possible wouldn't be there. Think of Benjamin Libet, spending years devising the experiment, having bitter disappointment as the grant applications are turned down one after the other, etc., etc. That's what intention and will in the real world is. It's much more complex, and in particular, it has huge temporal depth and draws on the community of minds to which we all belong. So, for this reason, peering into the brain is unlikely to give us much insight, certainly into free will, but all to these higher order things like our sense of beauty, wisdom, being in love, and so on and so forth. And I was put to you that the quintessence of neuromania is a mistake of trying to find the community of minds to which we belong, and I've described how it operates in the case of the lady volunteering for Libet's experiment. The community of mind that's been forged over thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, from a trillion cognitive handshakes. Trying to find that in bits of the standalone brain lighting up in the intracranial darkness. And you can see how that simply doesn't work. That would seem to be blindingly obvious, perhaps, to many of you, and you're already thinking, good Lord, how do people come to these kind of conclusions and so on? Well, I want to suggest that there are several reasons why people do merge brains and persons. First of all, there is a tendency in our discourse to personify the brain. They talk about brains making decisions. They talk about brain guessing, etc., etc. All sorts of language that's appropriate to persons tends to be applied to brains. Also, there's a tendency to describe brains as machines as things that process information, and consciousness as information. So persons who are conscious are information processors. And each of those four assumptions is quite seriously flawed. Some may say, yes, of course. Yeah, I mean, we realize essentially that if you look in the brain, you won't see the person. But actually, persons emerge from brains by the kind of processes that Dennett talked about. And they talk about emergence, they appeal to emergence of higher levels, different kinds of things. They appeal to complexity, and they appeal to what philosophers call supervenience, how basically things supervene on other things. So, for example, they take an example that John Searle gives, is water is composed of molecules. But actually, we see it as rather shiny, slippery stuff. And molecules aren't shiny and slippery, but those properties of water have emerged by all the molecules being added up. The mistake with that is that basically what he's doing is comparing two viewpoints. There's a viewpoint on water as molecules, and there's a viewpoint on water as we see it in everyday life. So that kind of emergence requires two viewpoints. Certainly the emergence argument, to me, reminds me, those of you who are old enough to remember Tommy Cooper, he used to do all sorts of magic tricks and then say, things happen just like that. And emergence is the just like that approach. Often, those who appeal to the brain, or want to defend the notion that brains of persons are identical, think by what we call transverse epithet, for the reasons I've described. But the other thing to do is, or may do, is they deny the reality of those things that neuroscience cannot accommodate. The idea that what neuroscience can't see of persons doesn't really exist. It's an illusion. So some philosophers have said that those experiences we have of warmth and cold and so on and so forth, they're just illusions. Of course, in order to have an illusion that you're conscious, you have to be conscious. So that argument bites the dust straight away. But there have been many philosophers who have disliked the notion or have tried to resist the idea that we do have thoughts, beliefs, and so on, things like that. These are called propositional attitudes. Patricia Churchland says the notion that we have, that the mind includes thoughts and beliefs, is an idea that belongs to folk psychology, which will evaporate with the advance of neuroscience. And then, because it's difficult to find the I, the self, or the ego in the brain, those too are illusions. And finally, because you cannot find agency in the brain, Libet failed to find it, Dylan Hayes failed to find it, then it is unreal. That's the wrong way round. I think we have a challenge to explain how we have feelings of warmth, how it is we have thoughts about things, how it is that I have a sense of my being a person, and so on, and how it is that we generally change the world. We shape the world. We are agents. You can see the effects of human agency in the impact we've had on the planet. So the strategy is of saying those things that neuroscience can't explain will prove, as neuroscience advances, to be unreal. And I will put to you that basically they are real, and the fact that neuroscience can't find them is not because they're unreal, it's because neuroscience falls short of explaining or accounting for those things. I want to end up on a note of humility, which is those of us who deny the identity of persons and brains still have something to answer, which is, if the brain isn't the basis of consciousness, why is it so intimately bound up with our awareness and behavior? What are we to make of the genuine advances in neuroscience, which have explained things about perception and so on and so forth? Am I suggesting that we should abandon brain science entirely as a source of understanding of some aspects of personhood? Where would the brain fit into a metaphysics, an epistemology, an ontology that denies the brain a place at their center? And how should we deal with the fact that we are, after all, evolved organisms, and our brains are evolved in this way, as well as persons? I've suggested those are real questions for people like me, but those questions won't be advanced if we confuse two things. If we confuse what we can see is going on in the brain with the life of a person in society. That confusion, or the notion that we can understand about the life of a person in society by, as it were, examining the brain, is a bit like imagining that by applying a stethoscope to an acorn, you will hear the whispering of the woods, which is the community of minds. Of course, there is no wood and no whispering without brains, without acorns. But you won't hear the whispering of the woods by peering harder and harder at the acorns. The benefits, ladies and gentlemen, I would suggest, of freeing ourselves from neuromania, we might see ourselves a bit more correctly, but more excitingly is the possibility of a new way of seeing the order of things and of our place in it. This is a point that's been made endlessly by a great philosopher, Thomas Nagel. Basically, he said, this problem of understanding the relationship between persons and brains isn't just a little local difficulty. It's the whole question about where mind and consciousness fits into the cosmos. And I want to quote from a pretty hard-headed psychologist, Jerry Fodor, who was involved in many of the developments of neurophilosophy in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and subsequently. And this is what he says, and it's worth thinking about this. He says, we can't, as things stand now, so much as imagine the solution to the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is the fact we have experiences, that there's something like it is to be Raymond Tallis, there's something like it is to be you. We can't, as things stand now, so much as imagine the solution to the hard problem of consciousness. The revisions of our concepts and theories that imagining a solution will eventually require are likely to be very deep and very unsettling. There is hardly anything we may not have to cut loose from before the problem is through with us. And I would say, bring it on. And I want to end with a quote from Gilbert Ryle. Man, and I put in woman because this is quotes from 1949. As it were, the default human being was a man in those days. Man, brackets woman, need not be degraded to a machine by being denied to be a ghost in a machine. He, she, might after all be a sort of animal, namely a higher mammal. There has yet to be ventured the hazardous leap to the hypothesis that perhaps he is man, or she is man or woman. And really, just about got there, didn't I? So I would like to suggest that the whole point of this talk is to try and encourage you to make this hazardous leap. Thank you for your attention, or for the courtesy of simulating it. Thank you.
Very much indeed, Ray, for delightful and stimulating
Thank you.
lecture. So our consciousness is fully informed
Engaged.
and awake with you. So I hope we do have some time for some questions. And Gregor and Harriet have got some roving microphones. So please raise your hands if you would like to pose a question.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Abdi Sanati. I'm a psychiatrist and actually chair of the philosophy special interest group at Royal College of Psychiatrists. Really enjoyed your talk, and just going to Libet's experiment, I was thinking, what if the result of the experiment was the other way around? How were they going to explain it? What would have caused that desire when it happened before?
Yeah.
I think, what would they expect to find anyway?
You're absolutely right. Supposing, for example, that Libet had found that the intention actually preceded the readiness potential, one would assume then that the attention had some kind of causal power. And it's been suggested that behind that is Libet's assumption that somehow that Libet is essentially a dualist. He imagined there would be some kind of mental cause of some physical event. And so you're quite right. If he'd found it the other way around, he would just be making, as it were, a metaphysical mistake rather than a much broader one.
Hi, I'm a neuroscience student. I'd just be really interested to know your opinion on panpsychism as an explanation of consciousness coming from matter and materialism.
Thank you. The question has been raised about panpsychism, and that is very tempting for those of us who are in a state of ontological agnosia, as I am. I don't quite know what kind of ontology one should have. Just to explain to the audience, panpsychism is the notion that basically consciousness is everywhere. And the argument for panpsychism, there are many arguments. One has been that basically science doesn't tell us what the intrinsic properties of the material world are. All science tells us is about how bits of matter interact. But there's one bit of matter that we have access to, and that bit of matter is our own brain, and we know that our own brains are conscious. From this, we might infer that consciousness is to be found everywhere in the material world. This is something that Bertrand Russell suggested, and it was very much picked up by A.N. Whitehead. And there are some contemporary philosophers, particularly Philip Goff and one or two other really good philosophers, who make that point. Panpsychism has at least two problems, but perhaps I'll just focus on one problem. If consciousness is everywhere, then why does it appear only to be in particular places? Conscious organisms. Why aren't socks and pebbles and electrons manifestly conscious if they're supposed to be conscious in some hidden way? And this, it's been argued that essentially what it is consciousness gets sort of gathered together in certain entities. And for example, in a brain, it'll get gathered together so it turns into a subject or a viewpoint. My own feeling is that just simply pushes the bump in the carpet further on. So what is there about a brain that makes it likely to bring together all these sequins of consciousness that are scattered throughout the universe? So although I admire the courage of people who are panpsychists, they've been described as crazy, I'm not too sure I accept their views. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ray. That was terrific. And I agree with you entirely that persons are not brains, and it's a mug's game trying to explain everything about people and society just by looking at brains. But once or twice you veered towards some more fundamental, ontological, metaphysical thoughts, and I wanted to press you a bit about that. At one point, I think you said that the intentionality of conscious perception broke the causal closure of the material, and you had that rather moving quote from Du Bois Raymond, where he said, he and Brucker, when young men, they pledged that there would be no forces operating inside bodies apart from fundamental physical, and they thought chemical forces at that time. And the suggestion was you disagreed with them. So I wondered if you think there are forces operating inside bodies that aren't ordinary physical and chemical forces, and if so, shouldn't we tell the people in the physics departments so they should go and identify them? A serious question. So what do you think about that?
Oh, that's very generous. David Papineau is a very distinguished philosopher, as many of you will know. It seems to me that when I was thinking about breaking a causally closed world, I wasn't suggesting this as some additional external cause, some additional external force. That would be completely wrong. That would be almost as bad as the extramission idea. I don't quite know how to fit it in. I mean, I'm totally one with Jerry Fodor. We just don't know how to fit it in. The fact remains is we are outside of the world we are in. We're both causally wired into it, but also we face it as creatures who are incompletely wired in this way. But I don't have an answer to your very good question. My defense would be that basically clearing away the wrong answers would make the path, hopefully, to people brighter than me and successors will actually start really rethinking along the lines that Fodor suggests. But the very notion of agency, I mean, Kant was terribly aware of this, as you know, but is of something that seems to, as it were, not randomly interfere with the causal network or the laws of nature. It's something that is from outside in a sort of way. But I don't quite know how to locate that outside without making it seem like a causal outside, and I think that's wrong. So basically, I'm completely stuck. I'm an ontological agnostic. Yeah.
Wondering if you or anybody thinks that the consciousness isn't just in the brain, or the person is not identical with the brain, does that leave open that perhaps some other organ might be also importantly involved, like the stomach has been recently cited as maybe an independent centre of some thought processes or emotions and things like this?
So the question is if consciousness is not in the brain, could it be, as it were, more broadly spread? And of course, some philosophers have now discovered the body. It's a revelation. And, and there's the notion of the embodied mind. It just seems to me that the whole notion of locating consciousness is probably category error. And that to locate it in the stomach or is no more easy to accept than locating in the brain. In fact, much less, because you can take my stomach out and I'm still conscious. So I don't think that would that's going to help us. But there's certainly a great movement to, as it were, discover that the mind is not confined to the intracranial darkness. But it doesn't seem to help. Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering, so if you are not your brain, I was wondering if you could address altered states of consciousness, such as the psychedelic state. So recently, evidence has started to suggest that there's this concept of ego dissolution, where the sense of self breaks down. And they found through various studies, such as fMRI studies, that this is correlated with the breakdown of the neural default mode network in the brain. So if the sense of self is not, in fact, in the brain, how would you address findings like that?
What a good question. I mean, it seems to me that, if you like, you can think of the brain as the platform. It is a springy off position, but we've gone, as it were, collectively, we've gone beyond our individual brains. We've gone beyond the things you can see at fMRI scan. So, in a way, I don't think that contradicts the fundamental thesis that if you want to understand love, wisdom, beauty, you don't peer into the intracranial darkness. You basically look at the community of minds. So I don't think those kinds of correlations, which I completely accept, undermine that fundamental thesis.
Thanks very much. It was a great talk. I'm a psychiatrist, a neuropsychiatrist, and I was in clinic this morning, and one of the patients with Parkinson's disease turned up, and she'd started a dopamine agonist, and this had caused her to start gambling excessively. To start gambling excessively. It completely changed her moral reasoning, her personality, a tiny little molecule. It feels as if you're sort of downplaying these very consistent findings that we find in neuroscience.
I think that yes, so you were kindly describing a patient whose personality was totally transformed by starting on anti-Parkinson's drugs. And that's well described, isn't it? Dopamine agonists and so on and so forth. I have no doubt about the vulnerability of ourselves through things that act on the brain. But it's interesting, she will have engaged with you, partly she will have come with you symptoms, but the thing that brought her to the clinic, the thing that created the discourse between you, the discourse between you and your colleagues, and the overall discourse of trying to understand what it is that within the brain that may bring about these changes, that doesn't belong to the brain. Do you see what I mean? We're all surrounded, a bit like Leavitt's experiments. He was looking at what's happening in the brain, but the very experiment itself couldn't be explained by the kind of things he's looking at.
Hi, thanks. I'm a medical student. Thanks for the talk.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, so you said that having the physical matter of the brain was a necessary but not a sufficient condition for consciousness. Could that mean, in principle, you could have the physical matter of the brain without consciousness, like one of the, I think, zombies that Wittgenstein talked about? And how would you sort of address that sort of idea?
That is an incredibly good and difficult question, because it arises when people talk about, say, emulating the brain, that you replicate pretty well all aspects of the brain. Would that replica, if it were possible, actually then be conscious? And this is one of the things that preoccupy transhumanists, isn't it? Uploading some aspect of the brain onto some non-degradable material so you can live forever. My feeling about that is that whereas in principle it's possible to imagine you could have something that's identical to my brain without it having those properties, it might not have those properties because it hasn't got the same history. So if you, say, download either my connectome or my connectome plus all the juices or whatever, it won't have had the same history as, upload, it won't have had the same history as me. That's the sort of angle from which I would approach the zombie problem. But you're quite right. Given that we don't understand how it is that the brain is a necessary condition of consciousness, we cannot rule out the fact you could have a brain without consciousness. That's a lousy answer to a really good question. And I'll wake up in the middle of the night thinking, wish I'd answered it better. So.
Hi, I have a question about the problem of consciousness. So I think I agree with you totally that I'm not identical to my brain for the kinds of philosophical reasons you gave. But when I try to articulate what the problem of consciousness is, So I'm a little suspicious of that Fodor sort of thought that you put on at the end, that we are going to discover some new concepts that will enable us to explain a problem that we don't quite understand. I think I don't understand the problem, but I'm a bit suspicious that. So when I think, is the problem of consciousness the problem, how can matter, something that is purely material, be conscious? You could think, well, you know, you might think that the problem is a much bigger problem. How can something that is purely material be a self-mover, for example, like an ant is? Or how can it be something that has some kind of perceptual capacities, but perhaps not the kind of self-consciousness that human beings have? So what exactly is the problem of consciousness?
The problem of consciousness, gosh, yes. I mean, first of all, to defend Fodor, I don't think he was promising anything, but he was saying if we're going to make progress, we've got to stop going down the same well-beaten tracks and ending up at the same end of the same cul-de-sac. And I would like to give you an analogy. In 1900, Max Planck observed something very strange about black body radiation. And if he said, oh, bugger this, it doesn't fit with my experiments, etc., and forgot it, we would have lost all of quantum mechanics and all the utter transformation of our understanding of matter that's followed from that. So I would suggest to you that if we accept that the relationship between the brain and consciousness is not just a little local difficulty, but it demands much more of us to make sense of it, I think that was the force of what Fodor was saying. As for what is consciousness, I don't think there's a single answer to that. I mean, we all know what the hard problem of consciousness is, that there is something, that it's like to be something. But consciousness has many levels. It has a level of perception. It has levels of propositional attitude. That something is the case. It has a first-person dimension, that this experience is being had by me, and so on and so forth. It's very, very complicated and layered. Can you come back to me? Have I sort of responded to your question? I mean, I've already done one bad answer to a question. I better not do two, otherwise I'll get this back.
I suppose. I think what I feel is that there is, I'm not very sure whether the question is, okay, we know that it is something material because we are material beings. What we don't know is, you know, how the complexity of the arrangement of this material being produces or enables us to be conscious beings, not the brain, but us as human beings. I do understand that problem, but I see that as a problem which is primarily a scientific problem, to have more knowledge about how these very complex things work. I think that's independent of, that doesn't mean that I am my brain. It just means that understanding what a conscious human being is and how this complex thing enables us to have the abilities and capacities, very sophisticated, that we have, it's a very difficult problem and we haven't explained it, but it doesn't seem to me that it is a conceptual problem for which we don't have the concepts, because we already know that it is the case that things that are purely material are conscious.
Well, I'd like to put back to you, I don't think we know what matter is. You know, people talk about dark matter, and I would suggest all matter is dark. And certainly, if you look at the two major theories in physics, they're actually completely contradictory to each other and so on. So I don't think we know what matter is. So to say something is a material object actually doesn't seem to be, to me, to be the end of the matter. And the second thing, so to speak, the idea that we are material objects that are distinguished by a certain complexity is also something that doesn't appeal to me, because the notion of complexity is actually highly subjective. From a standpoint of, one standpoint, a crystal is incredibly simple. From another standpoint, it is inexpressibly complex. So the notion of that we are matter, but we're matter that has a certain form of complexity, doesn't seem to me it seems to be wrong at two levels. In other words, it seems to be shutting off the debate too early. And there's a revelation to be had, and it requires incredible boldness. And that's why I don't want to shut off the debate by saying the kind of things that, for reasons I understand, you were saying. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm a philosophy postdoc from University of Hertfordshire, And I was just wondering whether it seemed to me that one thing you say sort of to the brute identity theorist, sort of the materialist who says, the person is the brain, you say, you're forgetting about the context, you're forgetting about the other minds and, the past and so on. And I just wonder if, a more sophisticated materialist couldn't sort of reply and sort of say, yeah, sure, I believe there is this context is important for the individual person or the individual mind, but I just hold that the context also ultimately is grounded in physical facts, so there's a sort of maybe more sophisticated version of materialism, available. So I just wonder what you would say to them.
Thank you for that. So essentially, we can get from the brain, as it were, to the community context, to the context of the community minds, just by really working harder and harder at our brain science. And what I would suggest is material objects don't have contexts in that sort of way. They don't face the world. They don't, as it were, have joined awareness of a collective world. All of those things, none of that seems to be available in our understanding of the material world. And the deeper we dig into it, and the more and more of the laws that Dennett refers to are emerging, we get no closer to that. The very notion of a context seems to me is something that isn't there in the material world, just like here and now aren't in the material world. They're the kinds of things that, in fact, are shared by quantitative, objective, fundamental science. Often people say, well, look, if we fully understood the brain, you're too impatient, you're an old man in a hurry, give it a few decades. But let me think of a complete understanding of the brain. What form would it take? Well, one form it would take would be basically a printout of billions and billions and billions of noughts and ones. Neurons firing, not firing, and so on. And that would get us no nearer to what it is to be happy or unhappy, to love music or hate music, and so on. So I'm not too sure that I feel that more work will eventually encompass the context that I've talked about as well.
I think you said there was a problem about intentionality.
Yes.
Because how could one bit of matter, our brain, be about something else? But is it not possible that natural selection has caused us to have that? For example, if I can give a hypothetical example, if there's a group of vervet monkeys in the jungle and one of them espies a leopard, dangerous predator, it will immediately emit a characteristic shriek, and all the other vervets will race to the top of the trees and therefore survive and have descendants, which decided that the shriek was about something. Whereas all the philosophical vervets stayed on the ground and argued, they dithered. Could that shriek possibly be about anything? Well, they're going to get eaten and have no descendants. So we inherit this ability to talk about things as a result of natural selection.
It's interesting, Thomas Nagel makes a very good point. He says natural selection can only work on what's already available. So if you think of natural selection beginning at the beginning with unicellular organisms, at what point do we actually get somehow self-awareness, awareness, and so on and so forth, all these emerging? And by the way, it's not very clear what use they would be. If I was designing a vervet, I wouldn't rely on the vervet to, as it were, have a sense of the intentional meaning of the shriek. I'd just respond to the shriek very quickly without even being aware of it. If you were really serious about an organism that's going to work, it would be basically one that sticks to the laws of material nature, which are, after all, as David Lewis says, unbreakable. Once you start getting conscious in the game, it's not clear what additional advantage produced, and it's not clear how it was sweated out of matter by beasts scratching each other's eyes out.
Well, we don't know that the vervets are conscious. That not really necessary.
I know, but if they're not conscious, then there is no obvious intentional object, explicit intentional object of the shriek.
Hello, Ray. Nice to hear from you again. I'd like to make what I regard as two clarifications. You're free to disagree, but first of all, with regard to matter, I don't think it's necessary for physicalists to regard matter as a fundamental ontology. Radiation is more fundamental. We think of an atom as a quantum coherent bound state of particles which each have a de Broglie wavelength, lambda equals h over mv, and that reaches the local energy minimum, which can be improved on by combining atoms, by hybridizing, electron overlap orbitals. So you're talking about assemblages of radiation which are stable, spatially stable over time for quite a long time. That's one thing. To address the hard problem question of your question there, I don't think Chalmers himself expressed it very coherently, but it seems to me that I'm looking at this red light, for instance. That red light has a character which distinguishes it from any other sensory input, at least as far as I'm concerned. So it seems to me that the problem there, prima facie, the problem is that the dimensional parameterizations of physics, mass, length, and time at the microscopic scale, and obviously other stuff at quantum we don't notice unless we do research, but we cannot reduce any of these sensory qualities. I don't like the word qualia because it's got a lot of baggage attached to it, but sensory qualities cannot be parameterized in terms of the fundamental dimensions of physics, whereas everything else in the external world can, and that is a problem. That's how I see it. Even Daniel Dennett himself doesn't express it that way, and I've had discussions with him about that. But thank you anyway.
Yeah, I'm not sure Dennett would agree with you there. I agree with you, but I'm not sure he agrees with you. And it's interesting about the hard problem and the easy problem. It's very interesting that Chalmers made his reputation for saying there is a hard problem, which is actually what it is like to be something. And he says there are easy problems like intelligence, cognitive interaction, and so on and so forth. As far as I'm concerned, all those easy problems actually are not any easier than the hard problem, because the hard problem is actually the ground floor, and the rest are subsequent stories. Yeah.
Hi, I'd like to congratulate you again on what was a brilliant lecture.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
You're very welcome.
At this stage, I must leave. Yes, thank you.
So I'm a third-year philosophy bachelor student doing a paper on Merleau-Ponty, and I was wondering if you could address your thoughts on the connection between the falsity of materialism and what you referred to as the community of minds.
Yeah.
Because it seems to me, you mentioned the idea of shared agency almost sort of in passing, and I was wondering if you could connect that to the idea that we are not our brains, because I understand that there is this sort of humanist position on it, but I was wondering if it went any deeper than that.
I think it does go deep. I mean, I'm very glad you're studying Merleau-Ponty. The book I just flashed up, the latest one, has got a whole chapter on Merleau-Ponty on embodiment, and I think he's very, very profound in this sense. And one of the things that that comes from his thinking, particularly his later thinking, is that our very idea of a material object as something independent and having intrinsic properties comes from our own experience of our bodies, which we only colonize incompletely and have a sense of it. It's more complicated than that. And actually Quine came to the same conclusion. He said our paradigm object is our own bodies. But, I've forgotten what I was going to say. Can you just remind me what I was going to say? Yeah.
The relation between the idea of shared agency and whether it goes any deeper than humanism, or whether it can address the falsity of materialism.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me shared agency as even individual agency, although the question whether we have individual agency or not is another matter, but it seems to me that the very fact that we are a point of origin in the world clearly doesn't fit with the notion of the universe unfolding as basically a causal sequence of events. The fact that we can be a point of origin can only be explained if we are somehow, in some sense, outside of the world, not in the sense of being an external cause outside of the causally closed world, coming back to David's point, but in some sense, so that we can operate from the outside. It's interesting, there's a posthumous paper published by John Stuart Mill on nature, fantastic paper, but he says that we have a responsibility, we cannot escape the laws of nature, but at any given moment, more than one law is operating, and we can, as it were, position ourselves to mobilize one law as opposed to other laws. And I think that's quite an interesting idea. You can see how I'm sort of wriggling around your question rather than answering it, but there may be something useful in the answer.
Okay, thank you.
We come to the end of our time and of our discussion, which could go on, and I wager will go on for some time. But thank you very much indeed, Ray, for a really super
Thank you very much. Thank you.